It would seem that there's a little hint in this chapter that there's a late date to the book of Ruth. That 7th verse gives me a clue. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel. And it's a strange custom, isn't it? That if you wanted to do a transaction and have it verified, have it witnessed, you took off your sandal and gave it to the person you were dealing with. The implication of verse 7 is that that's what used to happen. It was the custom in former times. That perhaps suggests that the book of Ruth was composed at a later date. One or two of us have raised the question in past weeks as to whether there's an historical basis for the book of Ruth, or whether it's best understood as a parable. I'm not sure that it matters a great deal, whichever way you come down in that argument. But to me, there seems to be nothing in it that would undermine an historical basis. And the fact that the family tree at the end of the chapter links in with the recorded history of Israel would suggest to me that this is perhaps based on history. It may have been romanticised, it may have been elaborated, bits of the story may have been left out. In other words, it may well have been edited. But I think there's an historical basis and that these characters were real. And it's interesting to see how these characters develop as the story goes on. Naomi fades into the background after chapter 1, but then comes back into the story and really is at the centre of the story, right at the end of it, where little Obed is put on her knee and she becomes his nurse. Ruth doesn't get much of a say at that point. I sometimes feel that Naomi perhaps was in danger of taking over. Now, I wouldn't want to make a joke at the expense of mothers-in-law, but there may just be a whiff of the fact there that Naomi was a bit of a dominant character, and Ruth didn't have a lot of say in the naming of this child. There are one or two strange traditions here behind this chapter which really are so alien to us today that if we were going to preach it, we would either have to leave them out completely or put in a little bit by word of explanation. This idea of the Levirate marriage, that if a man died and didn't leave children, then a close relative had to come and take his widow and father children by her. That would seem to us in our modern culture to be an absolutely bizarre thing to do. And it may have died out in Israel because perhaps that's covered by verse 7. That was the pattern of things in former times, who knows? But that's certainly where Boaz gets brought into the story. But there is this other redeemer. He's never named, incidentally. He's anonymous. Most of the characters in this story are named. But this other redeemer isn't named. He's just there as a kind of shadowy figure in the background. He has first right of refusal. Boaz is absolutely certain that if he's going to take Ruth as his wife, he's going to do it fairly and squarely. So he puts himself in a place where he can make contact with this other redeemer. The gate of the city is the obvious place to go to. And the Revised Standard Version has a lovely translation that's lost in the version I'm using, but it said, he just happened to come by. Curious little phrase. One of those phrases that I suppose we could all identify with. There are things in our lives that just happen at a certain time. At that moment, they seem quite insignificant. They just happen. And yet behind the scenes, God is working his purpose out. Now, if you're going to look for a key word in the book of Ruth, and as we come to the end, we're in a position to look back at the ground we've covered, I think it would be the word kindness. It's a translation of a lovely Hebrew term, hesed. For us, kindness can be a little bit of a vague term. If we say someone is a kind person, it maybe isn't much of a compliment. It's a bit vague, isn't it? We know that from Galatians 5 that kindness is part of the fruit of the Holy Spirit, so it's not to be sneezed at. But the Hebrew word that's translated in most of our English versions as kindness has a bit more grit to it than that. It's a word that speaks of love that's prepared to hang in, pay the price, go out of its way. I suppose the New Testament equivalent of that would be the word agape, which is the word that's used, of course, in the Gospels and the epistles of the love that God has for us in sending Jesus Christ to be our Redeemer. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And that's the word that I think holds this whole story together. Kindness, then, in summing up, has two particular aspects that this chapter brings to the fore. First, kindness, in the understanding of the writer of the book of Ruth, is something that's practical. It's not theoretical. It's seen in the light of God's kindness to us. The Lord has dealt kindly with us. And because he's dealt kindly with us, the logical conclusion, if you like, the natural outcome is that we should deal kindly with each other. To go to the New Testament, I would turn to the first epistle of John, where John says, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." There's a logical sequence there. And there's something incredibly incongruous if, having experienced the grace of God, we can't pass on that gritty kindness to others. It's practical. And there's so much practical love in the book of Ruth. We've seen it in chapters 2 and 3, where Boaz makes absolutely certain that Naomi gets an amount of grain when the day's work is over. We've seen it in the way in which the gleaners leave a margin round the edge of the field for those who are poor to go and help themselves. Boaz's kindness has even gone beyond that. He's actually ordered some of his gleaners to leave out some of the grain so that Ruth could collect them. It's kindness in abundance. It's kindness with a capital K. Kindness is practical. But the end of the chapter reminds us also that kindness should be universal. And perhaps you've realised that the only place in the New Testament where Ruth is mentioned by name is the opening chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Now, some time ago, I preached on the opening chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the family tree, as an Advent sermon. It seemed a good idea at the time. Now, I'm not sure I'd do it again, because some of the names there are unpronounceable. The secret is, if you come to long names when you're reading them out, do two things. Pretend you know how they're pronounced and say them quickly. And if you make a mistake, never admit it. Well, Matthew's Gospel starts with this very peculiar genealogy. I mean, if you're going to grip your readers in the opening lines, you wouldn't start with the family tree. So the family tree in Matthew's Gospel has a bit more to it than meets the eye. And there are 5 women mentioned in this family tree, which in Jewish tradition was quite an eye-opening thing in itself. But Ruth is mentioned by name, and she's mentioned as a foreigner. Interestingly, when Luke records the family tree of Jesus, in chapter 3 of his Gospel, he mentions Boaz, he mentions Jesse, he mentions David, but the bounder doesn't mention Ruth. Now, I would have thought it would have been the other way round, wouldn't you? Because Luke's Gospel, if you look at it as a whole, is the one that emphasises the role of women in the ministry of Jesus in so many lovely ways. But he doesn't mention Ruth by name. But Matthew much more in a Jewish tradition, breaks the rule and does. And I think Matthew is making a massive theological point at this stage. And he's saying the kindness of God is not just practical and to be shown in the practical dealings of his people, but the kindness of God is universal and it extends way beyond the borders of the people of God. So there you have this lovely book. I'm not sure how you'd preach it, but I have to say, I hope you would preach it. I think it comes round in the lectionary once every 3 years, and it's a good story, and it has an enormous amount of relevance, I feel, for us at this particular time. Now, who's going to pitch it?